Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the last session of this fantastic Progress Next conference. This is my first, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. My name is John Pasinic, and I am a product manager for the file transfer products. Specifically, what we're going to talk about today is MOVEit Transfer and MOVEit Automation. And really, I want to try and give you kind of an overview of what is managed file transfer, because it's not something that necessarily everyone knows. Then talk about our product portfolio and some common use cases, and then take any questions that you have. So without further ado, what is managed file transfer? It's really about moving securely files that are business critical. And the predominant use case that our customers generally use it for is system-to-system kind of transfers. So it's more of a lights-out operation where perhaps a bank is sending financial information from a regional location to a centralized location, or a hospital is sending medical billing claims to an insurance company. So those are really probably the predominant. We're talking about data centers, remote locations, trading partners, and we certainly do have other use cases. So we have system-to-person use cases. Think about going to your, investment portfolio and downloading a statement of your performance for the last quarter. That would be an example where you as an individual are triggering a download from a system that's in a lights out kind of mode, but then sending it to you as a person. Person to person is another one where, let's say I'm a tax preparer and you have come to me as a client and you want me to do your taxes and I need some documentation from you, so I might reach out to you with a secure email saying, please send me document A, B, and C. You then could respond to that secure email and send that information back to me in a fully encrypted form. So that's really what we're talking about there. And then there's also person-to-system kind of workflows where perhaps you're uploading an insurance claim. You've taken a photograph of damage to your vehicle and you're uploading it to an insurance company's site, and they're then going to take that data and process your claim. So that's really kind of the four primary areas where people use this. So there's a lot of challenges that come along with this. Security risks and the regulatory landscape are changing on a daily basis, if not more frequently than that. And so we're constantly having to update core components in the product. We're constantly having to address new regulations as they come about and provide to you tools that allow you to work within that environment. We know that there's been a huge proliferation of cloud file sharing tools, and while I agree they're highly convenient, they do come with associated security risks. And so, customers that really either have a regulatory requirement or just are concerned about protecting intellectual property are really the kinds of users that benefit from managed file transfer. And human and processing errors are the biggest threats. Repeatability of process is an area where managed file transfer really excels, because you have the ability to create scripts and then be able to flow your data through that and have a repeatable task that's auditable, and just exactly when a problem occurred, you can get to the root cause of it quickly and get it resolved. And, as smart as we all may be, we make mistakes, and in the world of protection of intellectual property and regulated data, that can result in fines that are, 7 figures or more. So sometimes, that really can be hugely detrimental. And really, at the end of the day, it's picking the right tools for the job. And, that's really where managed file transfer comes in. So security risks are growing. It's kind of interesting that on this chart, the only area that decreased last year was in healthcare, that the actual cost of cybercrime went down. Every other industry, it's growing, and growing at a pretty rapid rate. And it's not just a US problem, it's a worldwide problem. So when you're, sending data over the internet, you're really, at risk. The costs are large. Year over year, cost for cybercrime average per company up 12%, and over the last 5 years, a whopping 72%. So companies are freeing up money to pay to invest in these kinds of tools because it really, is something that is just exploding. Similarly, breaches per company is also growing at double-digit kind of rates, so 11% year over year and 67% over the last 5. As I mentioned, regulatory changes are the new normal. PCI and HIPAA, those are 2 that many of our customers adhere to in the primary verticals that we work within. But you think about GDPR. GDPR is another thing that's been driving customers to more secure methods of communicating data because the costs are so high if you do not comply with what those regulations are. And unfortunately, it's very difficult for software developers to necessarily be able to conclusively say that our product is compliant because there isn't enough case law yet to really have strict regulations. There's recommendations, but they're still a little bit fuzzy and gray as to what exactly they mean. And so we're taking feedback from customers and tightening up particular areas within our products. One that we did post the GDPR regulations going into effect was a auditable disclaimer on login so that a company could customize the security notice that was displayed, and any time that security notice was changed when users logged in, it would require them to acknowledge that they had read and agreed to those terms, and then in turn that was stored in an auditable database so that if there ever was a concern, they could go back and see, yes, all of these users that logged in between this time range had accepted this particular security notice. Not case law driven, but customers just having a fear that, they would be in violation if they didn't have some written evidence that people had complied. In California, the new data privacy laws that are going into effect, and this is really exploding around the world. There was one of my coworkers sent me one from Brazil yesterday where now they have privacy laws there. And I'm certainly hoping that in the US, if we're going down this road, we don't do it on a state-by-state basis. It becomes more of a national initiative because it's going to be very hard to understand all the variations and comply with them. And PCI is always changing. We have TLS 1.3 that I don't believe it goes into effect officially until March of 2020, but there's about a 6-month window of testing and validation for TLS 1.3. So these are the kinds of things that we have to be dealing with on a regular basis, and in turn, customers that are using these kinds of tools, their expectation is that when TLS 1.3 goes live, that the products, that there are products out there that are compliant with that so that they can take advantage of that. So as I mentioned earlier on, cloud file sharing, there's really kind of 3 primary classes, I suppose, of, sharing data, old school, and we still have tools that work in the FTP server space. WSFTP server is a product that's been on the market for decades. It's one of our, legacy flagship products. We still sell quite a bit of it. And it offers protection and visibility, but it doesn't necessarily offer the kind of protection and visibility that a managed file transfer application supports. Cloud file sharing is kind of snuck in the middle of these 2, and while it really excels from a user experience perspective, it falls down on the job when it comes to auditing and on security and on key management, not being able to know who touched the data, having a remote device fall in the wrong hands and data be extracted from that device. Those are the things that keep, security officers up at night and, keep, attorneys and others busy, fighting case law to try and keep a handle on that kind of stuff. So as I mentioned, our portfolio, MOVEit at the top, that's really, the secure file repository, which is MOVEit Transfer, and then MOVEit Automation, which is a workflow orchestration tool for being able to move data, not only between hosts at your end and MOVEit Transfer servers, but also between just, a UNC share and an S3 bucket, or an FTP server and a local folder on your local hard drive, for example. WSFTP, still widely used, but it's for environments that are not security regulated to the extent that MOVEit is. So you've still got data that's encrypted in transit, but it's not necessarily encrypted at rest unless you're using some means of encryption, whether it's volume encryption or whether you're putting it into a PGP encrypted format, something like that. MessageWay is an EDI product that we also sell. So this is used, we have one very, very large bank that this is one of their backbone products that they're using for doing EDI communication. And then Ipswitch Analytics is a data reporting and aggregation tool. So if you have multiple MOVEit transfer and automation servers, it takes data from the logs of those servers and puts it into a centralized dashboard and reporting tool so that customers that are managing larger environments have a central source to go to for that. So the problems that we solve, it's really all about securely transferring business critical data. We have a great level of control over that data between the users, locations, and partners. So we incorporate something known as non-repudiation. So we're using hashing to be able to verify that this transaction came from this address and maintains its integrity throughout the entire process so that you in turn can, be assured that what you received is what was originally sent. And then the whole automation of workflows, taking the human element out of it so that when you're transferring data, you're using a repeatable process so that there is a failure, it can be identified and corrected, and really it's all about compliance. Customers that are using these tools are really driven by that. But at the same time, they don't want a product that's burdensome. They want something that's simple. They want something that, normal people can get in and use effectively. It's typically not, scripting at the level that you require programming expertise. We're talking about more simple types of scripting applications that are used for gathering data. And we have a number of built-in functions that are common things that people would use so that you don't have to go out and write code to do those. So talking a little bit more about MOVEit, the data that's encrypted, it's encrypted in transit and at rest. The cryptography that it's using is a crypto library that we wrote. And we have it tested by a third party. It's validated and it's NIST certified. And this is something we're very proud of. There's not many vendors out there that really understand cryptography at the level that Ipswitch does. And it really allows you to have a great deal of reassurance that your data is protected. And licensing a third party tool does expose you to vulnerabilities because you potentially could have an issue with that third-party tool that if you're not really familiar with all the nuances of it, you wouldn't necessarily be able to understand how to identify it, how to correct it, and then in turn control the timeline on getting that kind of issue resolved. From a collaboration perspective, we know that not everyone is, super computer savvy, so we have built in very simple interfaces for the person-to-person kind of workflows or person-to-server kind of workflows, so a browser drag-and-drop type of UI for uploading and downloading content. We also have secure email clients that interface with Outlook. So from within Outlook, when you go to attach a file, you have the option of attaching just a normal non-encrypted file or attaching an encrypted file, and it also encrypts the body of the message. So when the recipient receives that, they don't see anything until they have authenticated, which takes them to the MOVEit transfer server, which is where the attached file actually resides, and also where that secure message resides. And there's a number of controls that we've built into that. For example, the number of downloads, we can control that, for example, this file can only be downloaded 1 time or 2 times or 10 times. And also an expiration date on that so that this data is less vulnerable because it's not sitting out there in the wild, potentially to be accessed by someone who shouldn't. Again, as I mentioned on the automation front, it's really about, being able to define repeatable tasks, but do so with an easy to use kind of interface, so that you don't have to have, high level programming expertise to do this. And then from a scalability perspective, we have the ability to configure the MOVEit transfer servers in a web farm configuration. So you would have a load balancer sitting in front of n number of servers, and they are all working off of a common data store and common database. The database could be clustered for high availability as well, but it really allows you to to handle very large loads, but doing with a single endpoint so that people don't have to go connect to multiple servers. They just connect to a single IP address, and then it handles all the heavy lifting from there. And we also offer a disaster recovery or failover product. So in turn, you can have multiple servers that are connected with a heartbeat channel between them. And there is only one, in this case, primary, but you could have a secondary and a tertiary node. And it synchronizes just the critical information, or the changing information is maybe the better way to say it, between those servers. So it understands our application. We have had plugins developed specifically for our applications. So it knows, for example, the directory structures that need to be synchronized, the registry keys, or the services that we're utilizing, so that if in the event that the primary server has a failure, and that failure could be, as simple as the network interface card went bad, or somebody kicked the cable, or it could be power supply failed, or whatever, all the bad things that happen to servers. And it then would detect that, and it would basically do, it's kind of like DNS spoofing, where on the secondary node, it's fully configured to be an exact replica of the primary, and it would then make its network interface card available to the public network, and it would disable the public broadcasting of the network interface card on the primary that had gone down. And so you will see about a 30-second rollover time from where you do have downtime for that secondary to come live. But then once it does, you're ready to roll. And again, with that tertiary node, let's say, for an example, in your local data center, you've got the primary and the secondary, and you've got a tertiary node in a remote data center. You would be able to fail over to that remote data center if there was, for example, some kind of environmental issue, flooding, or, a thunderstorm that took out power, or whatever the case may be. From a compliance perspective, the two, as I mentioned, primary that we're driven by is HIPAA and PCI. We also, I should mention, we offer the product in two configurations, on-premise and as a cloud-hosted offering. And so in the cloud-hosted offering, we also have SOC 2 certification, and we pay every year to have those environments audited. And so we have a third-party auditor come in, audit those environments for compliance with all of these standards. And then in turn, when customers subscribe to the cloud SaaS offering of this, we provide to them the letters of attestation that we have gone through this. So it really lessens the burden on them going through compliance certification, that there's portions of the infrastructure that they can really benefit from the fact that we've already gone through that process. So secure by design, everything that we do, we have a secure development lifecycle process that we adhere to during development. The architecture and hosting, we are in the process of migrating our cloud-based offering from one vendor, and everything will be hosted by Microsoft in their Azure environment. And we're offering that in North America as well as in Europe. And in all cases, we have a primary deployment, and then we also have an active DR deployment that's in a different Azure data center. So we have 100% continuity. The only downtime really is any kind of patch management that's done, which is done on a scheduled basis, which is published so that customers know when the downtime would be. Everything we're doing is risk managed. So all of the team, for example, on our cloud operations team is, going through security training, background checks, all the normal prerequisites that you would imagine for that. And the same is true for any developers or QA members that are doing development work on the application itself. From an integration perspective, we can accommodate customer security policies. So I mentioned earlier, this ability to have a custom notification. So any policies that a customer wants to ensure have been adhered to, we can put that into the product. We offer a range of authentication methods. So there's the ability of defining users directly within the application, but then we interface with SAML and LDAP and ADFS. So for customers that typically larger customers are using that, we can use that as the authentication source and also have it drive groups and permissions down into the application so that they can control from a single source all of that permission data and have the MOVEit transfer server inherit that. And really, it's about eliminating security risks. That's really what we're driven by. And I mentioned earlier the non-repudiation, so confirmation of proof of delivery, the failover that I also mentioned, and scalability. So really, those are kind of 3 of the 6, I would say, primary pillars of the product. End-to-end protection, so the strong end-to-end cryptography and key management. And we also use a cryptographic data deletion. So when a customer deletes data, we're cryptographically overwriting that sector on the disk if they're using disk storage. In the case of blob storage, it's done differently. But that also, gives added protection to the data. Everything is visible, so we have dashboard interfaces. So from a data operations center perspective, you can have up on multiple monitors, being able to see what's coming in and going out of your server, or in the case of MOVEit automation, what tasks are running and specifically what tasks have failed, because those are the ones that you're probably going to be paying the most attention to. Everything is logged, and we can write out to syslog if that's what you use. But all of the logging is done in a tamper-evident log, so we're putting a hash and a sequence number on every line within the log. So if anyone attempts to go in and manually tamper with that, it's going to be traceable, and we'll be able to. We can never say that it's tamper-proof. I think that would be disingenuous to say that nobody could ever tamper with anything. But we at least will know, and we'll be able to identify when, and then physical security comes into play at that point to be able to deal with it further. And we talked earlier about the automated execution of transfers. Really, this tool is designed to be self-administered, so there's many aspects of the software where a quote-unquote trained administrator is really not involved. We really strive to make the interface simple and straightforward. So, for example, one of the features that we added back in April of last year was what we call secure folder sharing, essentially to benefit customers that have users that want enterprise, file sync and share kind of applications like Dropbox and Box and tools like that. So they want to share folders, but they aren't necessarily administrators, and we don't want to grant them more privileges than just that. So an administrator can say, you users in this room can share these folders, and we're going to limit so that maybe a half a dozen of you can only grant list and upload rights, and maybe another half a dozen have download and delete rights, and be able to kind of control what kind of sharing behavior you then in turn can grant to other users. So our 2 primary verticals, as I mentioned, healthcare and financial services, banking and insurance. So from a healthcare perspective, all of the data that is in our patient records is proprietary, and obviously we don't want shared. And so really, when hospitals, insurance companies are implementing any kind of secure transfer, that's the kind of information that they're generally protecting. There's also financial data that goes along with that, but things like the patient surveys for the ACA or insurance eligibility inquiries. This is something that my wife does on a daily basis. Claim submissions, billing and payments, all of this kind of data is highly sensitive. And so when banks are sending information, when doctors and insurance companies and hospitals are sending information, really that's where MOVEit and products like that come into play. And then in banking and financing, similar kinds of idea. You've got loan processing, you've got ACH notifications, you've got remittances that are going overseas, or lockbox applications. These are, again, areas where we need to make sure that the data is controlled end to end and know exactly who's touched it, and make sure that we're not violating any regulatory requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, this dashboard interface, Live View, is something that we added in the April 2018 release. So what you're seeing here, there's 4 tabs at the top, the blue, orange, or yellow, red, and green. And so it's showing in-flight uploads. There's some latency that we show, because some of these files could be very small and they would disappear from the screen very quickly. So we delay them up there for 30 seconds so that a system operator can see what's coming in or what's going out. A stalled transfer would be just that, where for one reason or another the network connection is stalled for a short period of time. And so when that threshold is exceeded, the transfer will move into that category, and you'll see the number increment there. I don't happen to have an example shown in this video. A failed transfer could occur for a number of different reasons. It could be a network disconnection. It could be that somebody manually canceled the transfer. I didn't really mention it, I don't think, earlier, but everything that we're dealing with here is standard protocols. So we're talking about FTP, FTPS, SFTP, HTTP, and HTTPS. And some of those protocols do not, within the header of the transfer, give any information about the total file size. So, for example, you can't necessarily calculate the end time of a transfer, even if you know the transfer rate, because you don't know the file size, because it hasn't been communicated to you. And that also comes into play with a failure, that if somebody cancels a transfer, we will detect that, depending on the protocol, as a partial transfer. So we will recognize that it isn't a complete file with a file, with a complete file handle at the end. However, we won't necessarily be able to tell you why it failed, because the disconnect could have occurred for a multitude of different reasons that aren't in turn conveyed to us. But really, LiveView is intended for running, as I said, in these data operations centers where you want that great visibility. Now, secure folder sharing, this is the area where an administrator is granting folder sharing permissions to a non-administrator, and then that non-administrator has the ability to share that folder with other users. So they could be internal users, they could be external users. So let me just go ahead and run through this. So I've got a bank, and I'm going to grant user John Scherer the ability to share that folder, and I'm going to limit the permissions that they can grant, so only upload and list. And so, think about maybe a bank loan officer is going to be able to upload information into this folder, but they're not going to be able to delete or download information because that's not their role in the organization. And then that user will go to that folder and share it out with another user, and when they try and share it, they will have limited permissions on what they can grant. So again, allowing the administrator to have some greater control over the behavior that user can do. And so in this case, when I try and select some of those options that I don't have available, it won't allow me to. And also the ability to send a custom notification so that when a user receives a notification that a folder has been shared with them, they understand the context behind why it was shared with them. So then this next example is more of a senior manager, similar workflow, granting permissions, but in this case, this user has the ability to grant any and all of the permissions if they so desire. And when I say any and all, it doesn't mean all of the administrative permissions. It's still non-administrative level, so upload, download, list files, get notifications, and we've also added an option in here for list users. There is a workflow where you could create a folder where you want 10 people to be able to upload into that folder, but you don't necessarily want them to be able to see the content of other users that have uploaded to that folder, and you might not even want them to know who the names are of those other users, because another big area that we spend a lot of time within the product is making sure that we're not leaking information. So even if somebody can't access a folder, we don't even want to let them know that that folder exists. So, same with users. If users shouldn't know if other users are on the system, we're not going to allow them to see that kind of information. Now, I also mentioned that, simple drag and drop types of interfaces. So what you're seeing here, this is the web interface of MOVEit Transfer. And then in the upper right corner is a standard Windows File Explorer window. And in the lower right corner is a REST API-based client interface. And what this is really intended for is to sit on the desktop of your Windows machine, a Mac, or a Linux box, and allow you to upload and download content. And the permissions that you have will alter the behavior of the product. So for example, if you only have upload rights to a folder, if you go to a file in that folder, the download option won't even be available to you. So it really tries to control, what tools you have available so that we don't have to go through a big learning process of teaching people how to use the tool. So let me just go ahead and run through a couple simple examples here. So the first one is going to be dragging and dropping a folder that contains subfolders and content. So in one operation, you can very quickly upload a number of different files without having to do them individually. And then over in the web interface, I'm just drilling down in to kind of look at that. As you might expect, things like Shift Select and Control Select to be able to multi-select files to either download or delete. So simple paradigms that users are used to doing. Many FTP clients, for example, don't provide these kind of interface tools, and people get confused on how to use them because of that. Other simple things like inline file renaming, so a slow click on a file name or on a folder name, if you have the rights to do it, will allow you to rename those files. So again, trying to make secure folder sharing not something for just lights out kind of server to server operations, but opening it up to people to use in more of the person to person kind of use cases. What's being illustrated there is showing you the permissions that other shared users have on that folder. So for example, when it comes to data leakage, just because I have access to a shared folder, if I have no knowledge of other people that have access to that folder, I might potentially upload something into that folder that shouldn't be visible by someone, a particular grade within the organization, for example, or that doesn't have security clearances. And so that visibility, it's controllable by the administrator, but when it's turned on, you now get the ability to know who else has access to that folder and what in turn controls or access they have to that folder. So MOVEit Automation, this is really the other product within the MOVEit family. This is the dashboard interface for that. And so when you're setting up MOVEit Automation, on a daily basis, you're running tasks. But before you can run tasks, you have to define the host that you're going to be interacting with. So we actually right in the beginning, when you first install the product, it runs you through a little wizard. And the first step is to define the host that you're going to interact with. So as I mentioned, a host could be another FTP server, it could be a UNC share, it could be a local folder on your server, it could be an S3 bucket, and so those are the endpoints that you're going to be moving data to or from. Once you've defined your hosts, you then define tasks that are going to run on those hosts or against those hosts. And there's also keys and certs that are involved. So from a security perspective, we have SSH and SSL keys and also PGP keys. And one of the areas where transfers can fail is if the key is expired. And so we want to make sure that administrators know what the health of the keys are that are on their servers, and we show them obviously expired keys, which is definitely going to cause a failure, but we also notify them of any keys or certs that are going to be expiring within the next 14 days so that they can take remedial action, reach out to that partner, that person, and get an updated key so that they in turn can keep those tasks running. The widget that's down in the lower right corner is a widget for looking at watch tasks. So on a server where you might have hundreds or thousands of tasks, they have varying levels of importance and priority. And the watch tasks are a special attribute that you can set on a task, which then in turn makes it show up in this widget. And I think the example was used earlier during the keynote this morning by Yogesh about like payroll, right? Payroll is a task that you don't want to have fail. And so if payroll does fail, heads roll, and so you want to make sure that you're keeping track on that. Notifications are fine, but you want to make sure that you're looking at this and being able to take corrective action when something like that happens. And so that's really what that's used for. And then also customers want to know what the level of activity is on their hosts and the level of activity on their tasks. So this gives them just a clear indication of what's going on there. So this video goes through a wide variety of different things. So by clicking on the failed tab there at the top, it takes you down into the specific area within the product where those failed tasks are located. And I'm just running through a variety of different areas within the UI to just kind of illustrate what they all show. The bouncy bar graph isn't bouncy anymore. We found it was kind of cute, but a little distracting. So now it just shows you the value, but no bouncing. Definition of a new host, those are the host types. And there's 3 different types of tasks: traditional, advanced, and synchronization. Simple tasks are just that. The advanced tasks are where you can put in if-then logic and be able to have scripts executing and more level of sophistication. And synchronization is just that. I want to have this folder on this host and this folder on that host synchronized so any additions or deletions are reflected in both locations. Tasks also have different categories, so they can be enabled, they can be disabled, which means that if they were a scheduled task, they will not run on the scheduled according to the schedule. You could also have defined a task but not yet scheduled it. And then they can also be incomplete, where you haven't provided all the parameters for that task to run, and so it's just sitting there in kind of that intermediate state until you complete that. So another thing that we worked on this year, and we're pretty proud of this, although now we're learning all about the cool connectors that Progress has, so we'll have to be doing more work in this area, I'm sure. But MuleSoft, for those of you who don't know, was acquired by Salesforce for the tidy sum of, I think it was $6.5 billion, a pretty large acquisition. And in the iPaaS space, so integration platform as a service, in our 2 primary verticals, Gartner, who we talk with on a regular basis, gave us information about, their presence within that vertical or those verticals. And, it was pretty clear that if we were going to partner with somebody, that they would be the one that we would partner with just because of their presence within that space. Well, they made it very easy for us in that they came to us and asked us to develop a connector for their product. And it actually was a pretty easy task in that we had developed REST APIs for MOVEit Transfer that would support the use cases that we needed to be able to support. So essentially having MOVEit Transfer be an endpoint within a MuleSoft workflow where customers could upload data, to MOVEit Transfer from, let's say, Salesforce, or from, an Oracle financial application. They want to pull data, secure data from MOVEit Transfer, and then utilize it within a workflow within Oracle. So let me just go ahead, I'll run through this. It's a free tool. Now, when I say free, you do have to be a subscriber to MuleSoft, but basically MuleSoft has what they call the Anypoint Exchange, which is kind of like the Apple Store or Google Store for connectors. And in the workflow that we're going to show here, we're going to just do a very simple task of taking data from an Amazon S3 bucket and uploading it to MOVEit Transfer, and then sending a notification to Slack. So all 3 of those products have connectors, and it's basically a drag and drop kind of operation where you can define a flow between those different applications without having to know the individual APIs. So they basically put a wrapper around the APIs. They use all of our REST calls, but then present them in a very standardized way so that users, can utilize these tools. And it's really a no-code or low-code kind of application. So pretty cool. It's a growing market. So, we think it's good for MOVEit, and it's good for, users within that MuleSoft ecosystem. So that concludes what I was going to go through. I would love to take any questions that you have.
Did you decide to go for a proprietary encryption method, whereas there are plenty of standards which are validated by a lot of people?
Well, at the time when this was initially developed, which is decades ago, there weren't those same standards. And again, it was really a matter of being able to have, a deep knowledge from the lowest level to the highest level and be able to incorporate that encryption in all areas throughout our product. Now, for WSFTP, we use PGP encryption, which is, quite commonly used. We, potentially are going to provide other options in that area in the future. But for now, we are, really standing by our encryption. It's very efficient, and it's, NIST certified. So, it's a good, reliable tool. Other questions? It's not the end of the conference yet. Got a few more minutes. All right, excellent. Well, I thank you for your time.